The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as the small cafe buzzed with the morning crowd. The clinking of cups, the hum of conversation, and the occasional ring of the cash register created a familiar rhythm. It was just another ordinary day, or at least, that's what she thought. Then she saw him. At first, he was just a shadow at the edge of the window, hesitant and unsure. He stood outside in the cold, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken yet alert, scanning the cafe with the wariness of someone who had been turned away too many times before. She noticed the way he shuffled his feet, debating whether or not to step inside. His clothes were tattered, his shoes barely holding together. It wasn't just poverty that clung to him, it was defeat. Inside the cafe, the customers paid no attention to him. Or perhaps, they chose not to. She had seen this happen before. A well-dressed businessman at the counter ordered his latte, too busy checking his phone to notice the man outside. A group of students laughed at a joke, unaware of, or indifferent to, the hunger pressing against the glass. Then, as if making up his mind, the man finally stepped inside. The warmth of the cafe must have hit him instantly because he hesitated for a moment, taking in the scent of fresh pastries and hot food. But his relief was short-lived. The manager behind the counter stiffened, his sharp gaze locking onto the man like a predator sensing trouble. The barista beside him exchanged a knowing glance. She could already see it happening. The quiet, uncomfortable shifts of the customers. The unspoken understanding between the staff. They were waiting for him to beg, to be a nuisance, so they could throw him out without guilt. But the man didn't beg. Instead, he took slow, careful steps toward the counter, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills. The few coins he had barely made a sound as he placed them on the counter. "Do you have anything for this?" His voice was rough, cracked from dehydration, but polite. The manager barely glanced at the change. "That's not enough for anything on the menu." The man swallowed hard. He wasn't surprised. He had probably expected this. But he had to try. I haven't eaten since yesterday," he admitted quietly, avoiding eye contact. "Maybe, some leftovers?" The moment he said it, the room changed. A few customers looked up now, curious. Some wrinkled their noses, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The businessman at the counter cleared his throat, as if suddenly disturbed. The manager sighed. "We're not a charity. If you can't pay, you need to leave." It was always the same story. She couldn't take it anymore. Before she even realized what she was doing, she stepped forward. "I'll take care of it," she said, pulling out her own wallet. The man's eyes widened in surprise. The manager frowned. "You don't have to do that." "I want to," she insisted. "Ring up whatever the money covers, and I'll cover the rest." The manager let out a small scoff, but seeing the determination in her eyes, he didn't argue further. "Fine. Your choice." She turned back to the man and smiled. "What would you like?" He hesitated. It was as if he wasn't used to kindness. As if he feared it might be taken away at any moment. "Anything," he murmured. "Just something warm." She ordered a fresh meal, something filling, not just scraps. When it arrived, she led him to a quiet corner where he could eat in peace. He picked up the spoon with shaking hands and took the first bite. For a moment, his eyes closed, and his entire body relaxed. Relief. Gratitude. She sat across from him, watching in silence. "What's your name?" she finally asked. He glanced up, and for the first time, she noticed something strange, a mark on his wrist. A tattoo. Her breath caught. Why did it look familiar? But before she could ask, he spoke. I can't say," he admitted. "But, thank you." Something about his tone made her pause. There was more to this man than what met the eye. Then, as he finished his meal, he did something unexpected. He pulled a small, folded note from his pocket and slid it across the table to her. "No matter what happens," he said softly, "don't lose this." Confused, she picked it up. It was just a simple piece of paper, old and slightly crumpled. When she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. 4 words. That's all it said. And yet, those 4 words changed everything. "I never forgot you." Her breath hitched. Her mind raced. Who was this man? But before she could ask, he stood up and walked away, leaving behind only questions, and a past she never realized she had forgotten. The cafe door swung shut behind him, the soft chime of the bell barely noticeable over the racing of her heart. The note sat in her trembling hands, the 4 words staring back at her like a whisper from the past. "I never forgot you." She read them again, trying to make sense of them. Who was he? What did he mean? She glanced up, her eyes darting towards the window. The man was already moving down the sidewalk, his tattered coat flapping in the cold wind. Something inside her screamed that she shouldn't just let him disappear. She stood up so fast that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Heads turned, but she didn't care. She pushed past the counter and out the door, her breath catching the moment she stepped into the cold air. But he was gone. She scanned the street, looking left and right. The sidewalk was filled with people, but the man had vanished as if he had never been there. Her fingers tightened around the note. She forced herself to take a deep breath and turned back towards the cafe. The moment she stepped inside, she was met with stares. The manager was shaking his head, his arms crossed. "You know how this goes," he muttered. "Give them a free meal once, and they keep coming back." She ignored him and walked back to the table, sitting down slowly. Her heart was still pounding in her chest. What had just happened? She unfolded the note again, as if hoping the words would change, as if a second glance would suddenly provide clarity. "I never forgot you." She read them over and over. Did she know him? She searched her mind, trying to place his face. He looked familiar, but not in a way she could explain. Something about his eyes, the way he had looked at her, it was almost like... No. It wasn't possible. She had spent years in this town, working at the cafe, seeing the same faces every day. She would have remembered him, wouldn't she? Her eyes drifted to the table where he had been sitting. His plate was empty, wiped clean, but something else caught her attention. She frowned. There was something underneath the plate. A photograph. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, flipping it over. Her breath caught in her throat. It was old, the edges worn, the colors faded. But the image was still clear, a small child, no older than 5, standing in front of a playground. The child's face was partially turned away, but she recognized the place instantly. It was her. A chill ran down her spine. The cafe around her suddenly felt different. The familiar chatter of customers blurred into white noise, the hum of the coffee machine faded into the background. It was as if time had stopped. She looked at the note again. "I never forgot you." Then she looked at the photo. The man knew her. But how? The memories began to stir. Her mind raced, trying to pull together fragments of the past. She had been just a child in that picture, what could it mean? She turned the photo over. There was something written on the back. A date. 25 years ago. She swallowed hard. That was when she was living in the old neighborhood. The time when everything had been different. The time before she had moved away. The time before she had lost everything. A faint headache began to throb behind her eyes. She pressed the photo against the table, staring at it like it might somehow speak to her, whisper the truth she had forgotten. Who was that man? Why did he have a photo of her? She clenched her fists, determination creeping into her bones. She couldn't just let this go. There was something missing, something that had been kept from her. She had to find out. But where could she even start? She looked at the note again. What if this wasn't just a message? What if it was a clue? The tattoo, a symbol from the past. Her mind flashed back to the moment the man had sat across from her, the way his sleeve had slipped up, revealing that strange tattoo on his wrist. She had seen it before. But where? She closed her eyes, trying to recall. Then, like a spark in the darkness, a memory hit her. A boy, much younger, laughing, running barefoot through the dirt. He had that same tattoo, drawn in marker, pretending to be part of some secret group. Her eyes flew open. It was him. She knew that tattoo because she had once drawn it herself. On a little boy she used to know. Her hands shook. The note. The photograph. The tattoo. It was all connected. She gasped. The homeless man. He was someone from her past. Someone she had once loved. And somehow, after all these years, he had found her. The search for the truth begins. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She grabbed her jacket and shoved the note and photograph into her pocket. Her heart pounded as she hurried toward the door. The manager called after her, "Where are you going?" But she didn't stop. She couldn't. There was a ghost from her past walking the streets. And she had to find him, before it was too late. She walked swiftly through the streets, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold wind bit at her face, but she barely noticed. The note, the photograph, the tattoo, everything pointed to one undeniable truth. She knew him. Somewhere deep in her memory, buried under years of routine and normalcy, lay the answer. But she needed to see him again. She needed to know the truth. Her eyes scanned the sidewalks, searching for a familiar tattered jacket or the slow, tired walk of a man who carried the weight of something unspoken. But he was nowhere. She asked a street vendor if they had seen him. Homeless guy? Tall, skinny? Yeah, he passed by here not long ago. Headed toward the train station, I think. Her stomach twisted. The train station? Was he leaving? She ran. The streets blurred past her. She didn't care about the odd looks from pedestrians, didn't care that her breath was coming in ragged gasps. All that mattered was finding him before it was too late. A face from the past. She reached the train station just as the intercom announced an arriving train. Her eyes darted wildly across the crowded platforms. Then she saw him. He stood near a bench, shoulders slumped, his hands stuffed into his worn-out jacket. Relief and urgency crashed over her at once. She called out to him. He turned, startled. For a moment, he didn't recognize her. But then, his expression changed. Shock. Guilt. Something deeper, something like hope. He took a step back. She took a step forward. You left this, she said, holding up the note. And this? She showed him the photograph. His breath caught. I told you to keep it, he said quietly. I don't understand, she admitted. I don't understand any of this. He hesitated. His fingers twitched at his sides. Then, finally, he spoke. You really don't remember me, do you? She swallowed hard. I think I do, she whispered. I just don't know how. He let out a soft, broken chuckle. That makes two of us. A childhood forgotten. He motioned to the bench, and they sat. For a moment, they were just two people, strangers, yet not. Then, he pulled back his sleeve, revealing the tattoo again. You drew this, he said simply. She stared at it, memories flickering like an old film reel in her mind. A dusty playground. Laughter. A small boy's outstretched arm. Her own childish giggle as she drew the tattoo on his wrist with a stolen marker. We were kids, she whispered. He nodded. We were more than that, he added. Her brows furrowed. What do you mean? His jaw tightened. You really don't remember, do you? She shook her head. He exhaled slowly, staring down at his worn shoes. I thought I could just leave you with the note and disappear. I thought maybe you were better off not knowing. Her chest tightened. Not knowing what? He was silent for a long time. Then he looked at her, really looked at her. The truth, he said. And in that moment, she knew. Everything was about to change. A letter from the past. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small and folded. A letter. Her fingers trembled as she took it. It was old, the edges worn, the ink faded. I wrote this a long time ago, he said. For you. She carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar, childlike, shaky, but full of emotion. Her throat tightened as she began to read. I don't know where you are. I don't know if you'll ever read this. But if you do, please don't forget me. Please don't forget us. You were my only family. My only friend. And they took you away. I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped missing you. I never forgot you. Tears blurred her vision. Her own name was scrawled at the bottom. She looked up at him, her hands shaking. You were. He nodded. We were in the same foster home, he said softly. Her breath hitched. And suddenly, it all came flooding back. Memories that refused to stay buried. The sound of heavy doors slamming shut. The smell of bleach and cold floors. Small hands clinging to each other in the dark. She gasped as the forgotten pieces of her childhood came rushing back. They had been inseparable. Two children in a broken system, each other's only family. Until the day they were ripped apart. She had been adopted. He hadn't. Her vision blurred. I don't remember leaving you. You didn't, he said. His voice was rough, but not with anger. Just pain. They took you. One day, you were just gone. She wiped at her tears. I didn't know. I didn't. He shook his head. It wasn't your fault. Her chest ached. How did you find me? She whispered. I didn't, he admitted. Not at first. I never knew what happened to you. But then. I ended up here. And today, I walked into that cafe. And there you were. She let out a soft, broken laugh. Fate, she whispered. He smiled, a real, genuine smile for the first time. Maybe. A choice that changed everything. She looked at him, really looked at him. The boy she once knew. The man life had broken. But not completely. You don't have to do this alone anymore, she said firmly. His eyes widened. What? I lost you once, she whispered. I won't lose you again. Tears filled his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. And for the first time in years, neither was she. The streets were quieter now, the afternoon rush fading into a lull. They sat on the bench outside the train station, the weight of the past pressing heavily between them. The letter trembled in her hands, the ink smudged slightly where her tears had fallen. She struggled to process everything. The little boy she had once called family was now a broken man, worn down by time and hardship. She had been adopted, given a life that had erased the memory of him, while he had been left behind, forgotten by the world. But he had never forgotten her. The thought made her chest ache. I can't believe it, she whispered, looking up at him. I don't know how I forgot. He let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. It's not your fault. You were just a kid. She shook her head, frustration bubbling inside her. But I should have remembered. I should have, she trailed off, gripping the letter tightly. What happened to you after I left? He exhaled, his gaze distant, as if he was staring into a past he wished he could forget. They moved me around. Different homes, different people. Some were okay. Some weren't. He paused, his jaw tightening. But I never stayed anywhere long. I guess I was too much trouble. Her stomach twisted. She knew what that meant. I kept looking for you, he continued. Every new home, every new school, I asked about you. But no one knew. It was like you just disappeared. She swallowed the lump in her throat. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. And then, when I was 16, I ran away. Her eyes widened. You. I had nothing to lose, he interrupted, shrugging. No one cared. And honestly, I didn't either. Her hands clenched. But I survived, he said quickly, as if trying to make it sound simple. Did whatever I had to. Jobs, shelters, the streets. It wasn't easy, but I managed. I told myself I'd find you one day. His voice grew quieter. But I never did. The guilt hit her like a punch to the gut. I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears threatening again. He shook his head. You don't have to be. It wasn't your fault. She inhaled sharply. But you had no one. His lips pressed together. Yeah, he admitted. For a long time. She felt the weight of those words, the loneliness behind them. And she hated it. She had been given a life, a home, a family, while he had been left with nothing. It wasn't fair. And she wouldn't let it stay that way. A lead from the past. She took a deep breath, pushing through the emotions threatening to drown her. There has to be a way to fix this, she said. His brows furrowed. Fix what? She met his gaze. All of it. He let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. You don't just fix a life like mine. She narrowed her eyes. Says who? He sighed. I appreciate it, I really do. But I've been on my own for a long time. I don't expect. Do you want to keep living like this? She cut in. Silence. His jaw tensed, but he didn't answer. She softened. Let me help you. He hesitated. How? She exhaled. For starters, I want to know more. About what happened after we were separated. There has to be records, right? He frowned. I guess. She pulled out her phone. Then let's find them. He gave her a doubtful look. You think you can just Google my entire childhood? She smirked. You'd be surprised what the internet can do. And she wasn't wrong. After some searching, she found an old foster care record with his name. And something else. Her breath caught. There's a name here, she said. His expression darkened. What name? She turned the screen towards him. A former caseworker. Someone who had been involved in their separation. He stared at the name, his hands clenching into fists. I remember her. She did too. And for the first time in years, they had a lead. Confronting the past. They tracked the caseworker down to a quiet suburban neighborhood. Her house was small but well kept, the kind of place that belonged to someone who had moved on from the past. She knocked on the door. A moment later, it opened. An older woman stood there, her sharp eyes scanning them curiously. Then, she paled. Her gaze landed on him, and recognition flashed across her face. Oh, she whispered. His jaw tightened. You remember me. It wasn't a question. She hesitated. You took her away from me, he said quietly. Her face fell. She glanced at her, then back at him. I didn't have a choice, she murmured. Didn't you? He shot back. A heavy silence fell between them. Then, the caseworker sighed. Come inside. The truth, finally revealed. They sat in her small living room, the air thick with tension. The caseworker folded her hands in her lap, staring at them both with an unreadable expression. I thought this day might come, she admitted. She swallowed. Then tell us. Why did you separate us? The woman sighed. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. He scoffed. Sure. She ignored him. You were both supposed to be adopted together. Their eyes widened, but something happened, the caseworker continued. A couple was interested in both of you. They wanted siblings. But before the paperwork was finalized, a wealthy family came in. They only wanted one child. Her stomach dropped. They wanted you, the caseworker said, looking at her. She felt sick. They had power. Influence. They didn't want to wait. They pulled some strings, made some calls, and they took you. She covered her mouth. And him? The caseworker's face darkened. They didn't care what happened to him. The world blurred around her. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They had been a family. They should have stayed together. She turned to him, guilt choking her. I didn't know. I did, he murmured. I found out years later. By then, it was too late. Tears filled her eyes. She had lived the life he was supposed to have. And now, she understood why he had been searching for her. It wasn't just about finding her. It was about finding closure. And for the first time, she knew. She wouldn't let him walk away this time. She reached over, gripping his hand. We were supposed to be family, she whispered. And we still are. His breath hitched. And for the first time in years, he believed her. The room felt colder now, as if the weight of the truth had sucked the warmth from the air. She sat frozen, her fingers still gripping his hand, while the caseworker sat across from them, her face etched with regret. Her mind replayed the words over and over. They didn't care what happened to him. A wealthy family had taken her, stolen her, from the only person who had ever mattered to her as a child. And she had lived a life of comfort while he had been left to fend for himself in a world that had never given him a chance. She swallowed hard, trying to keep the emotions from spilling over. I don't understand, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you fight for him? If you knew we were supposed to be together, why didn't you stop them? The caseworker sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. I did try, she admitted. But I was just a caseworker, not someone with power. The system was flawed. The adoption was rushed, and once you were gone, no one looked back. She hesitated. And by the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. He had already been placed into another home, and then another, and another. A bitter laugh escaped him. You make it sound like I was just a piece of paper lost in a pile. The woman flinched, but didn't deny it. That's exactly what happened, she murmured. And I'm sorry. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unforgiving. She turned to him, her chest tightening at the storm brewing behind his eyes. I had no idea, she whispered. He didn't look at her. I did. Her heart cracked. She had spent years living in ignorance, blissfully unaware of the brother she had once had. But he had known. He had known and had carried that pain alone. A hollow ache settled deep inside her. She had to make this right. A choice that couldn't be undone. She turned back to the caseworker. Where is the family that adopted me? The older woman hesitated. You don't know? Her stomach twisted. Know what? The caseworker exhaled. They passed away. The words hit her harder than she expected. For years, they had been her only family, at least, the only family she had remembered. And now, they were gone. She wasn't sure what she felt. Sadness? Loss? Or was it just the weight of everything crashing down at once? The caseworker continued, they left behind some paperwork. It might have answers about your adoption. Hope flickered inside her. Where is it? In storage, the woman admitted. But I can take you there. She turned to him, searching his face. Come with me. He hesitated, glancing away. I don't know if. Please, she urged, gripping his hand tighter. We started this together. We finish it together. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, slowly, he nodded. And just like that, the past was no longer a memory they could ignore. It was something they had to face. The forgotten files. The storage facility was dimly lit, rows of metal shelves stacked high with boxes that smelled of dust and old paper. The caseworker led them through the maze of forgotten documents until she stopped at a small, unmarked section. These files were never properly archived, she said, pulling out a worn cardboard box. They were supposed to be destroyed years ago. A chill ran through her. Destroyed? She swallowed the lump in her throat as the caseworker placed the box on a nearby table. The lid came off with a soft rustle, revealing stacks of yellowed papers. Her hands trembled as she reached inside. The first few documents were official records, adoption forms, birth certificates, legal jargon that blurred before her eyes. Then, she found it. A letter. One that had never been sent. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from her adoptive mother. Her heart pounded as she unfolded the fragile paper and began to read. Dear Social Services. I write to request information on the adoption of my daughter. She often asks about her family, and I believe she has memories of someone she was close to before she came to us. She speaks of a boy. A friend, a brother, maybe. She dreams of him. I wonder if she had a sibling she was separated from. If there are any records of another child, please let us know. With hope? Margaret and Thomas Walker. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She had asked about him. As a child, she had remembered. Her adoptive parents had tried to find out the truth. But the letter had never been answered. Her hands shook as she looked up at him. They tried to find you. His expression was unreadable. And? She turned to the caseworker. Why didn't they get a response? The older woman hesitated. Then, with a weary sigh, she said, because someone made sure they never did. Buried by the system. She dug deeper into the box, her fingers shaking as she flipped through more papers. Then, she found something strange. A rejection letter. Not from her adoptive parents, but from someone else. Her eyes widened as she read the first line. Request for information has been denied. The paper was stamped with an official seal, but the signature at the bottom was the most damning part. It was from a high-ranking official in the foster care system. One she recognized. Her voice was barely a whisper. You knew. The caseworker closed her eyes. I suspected. Suspected? He let out a bitter laugh. You mean you covered it up? I didn't have a choice, she murmured. Back then, people like me didn't get to question authority. The system was corrupt. Families with money got what they wanted, and kids like you, she shook her head. We weren't supposed to ask questions. The weight of her words settled like a stone in her chest. She had been taken, and when her adoptive parents had tried to find the truth, they had been shut down. Because the system had been designed to erase him. Her hands clenched into fists. I won't let them get away with this. The caseworker looked at her sadly. They already did. But she shook her head. Not anymore. She turned to him, fire burning in her veins. We have proof now, she said. We can fight this. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of everything. Then, for the first time, she saw something new in his eyes. Hope. Real, undeniable hope. He nodded. And just like that, they weren't just uncovering the past anymore. They were changing the future. The night air was thick with silence as they stepped out of the storage facility, their breaths visible in the cold. The weight of the documents they had uncovered pressed heavily against her chest. The truth was now out in the open, buried under years of bureaucratic corruption, negligence, and greed. She turned to him, watching as he stared at the streetlights, lost in thought. We have to do something, she said. He exhaled, rubbing his face. Do what? She clenched her fists. Expose them. Make sure no one else gets treated like this. A tired chuckle escaped him. You think people care? She flinched at his words, not because they were harsh, but because there was truth in them. But she refused to believe the world was that cruel. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she snapped a picture of the rejection letter. We don't need everyone to care, she said. We just need the right people to listen. He didn't argue, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. It was the doubt of someone who had been ignored for too long. But not anymore. The first step to justice. The next morning, she sat in her apartment, surrounded by papers. She had spent the night researching, cross-referencing names, trying to find anyone who could help. There were journalists who had covered corruption in foster care before. Lawyers who had fought cases like this. Advocates who had spent their lives bringing justice to forgotten children. She wrote down every name. Then she picked up her phone. She started calling. Some didn't answer. Some politely declined, saying the case was too old, the evidence too weak. She fought back frustration. Then, on the sixth call, a woman's voice on the other end of the line didn't say no. This is huge, the woman said. If what you're saying is true, we can use this. But I need more than a couple of old papers. I have a witness, she said. Someone it happened to. The woman paused. Then let's talk. A new fight begins. She met the reporter in a small cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee for warmth. He sat across from her, visibly uncomfortable. She could tell he wasn't used to this, the attention, the idea that people finally cared. But he sat there anyway. That meant something. The reporter listened carefully as he told his story. His voice was even, steady, but she could hear the pain beneath the words. When he finished, the reporter leaned back, exhaling. This isn't just one case, she said. If they covered this up, there are probably more. A cold shiver ran down her spine. How do we stop them? He asked. The reporter was silent for a moment, then said, we start by telling the world. The truth goes public. A week later, the article was published. The headline was bold, impossible to ignore. Separated by greed, the hidden corruption of the foster care system. She held her breath as she read it. It told everything. The illegal adoption, the destroyed records, the families that had been torn apart for profit. And most importantly, his story. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Comments poured in. People shared their own stories. Former foster children came forward with eerily similar experiences. And then, a lawyer called. I saw the article, the woman said. I want to help. The ones who didn't want to be found. It didn't take long for the wrong people to notice. 2 days later, she got a call from an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. Stop what you're doing. A chill ran down her spine. The voice was deep, controlled, and dangerous. If you keep pushing this, you'll regret it. Her grip on the phone tightened. I won't stop, she said. A long silence, then, the call ended. She stared at the screen, heart pounding. She turned to him. They know. His face darkened. Of course they do. A fight they didn't expect. She refused to be scared. She refused to back down. They met with the lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman who had spent years tearing apart corrupt systems. I won't lie to you, she said. This will be a fight. They will come after you. They will discredit you. They will try to make this disappear. He took a deep breath. I've been invisible my whole life. I'm not disappearing again. The lawyer nodded. Then let's make them pay. Justice at a cost. The case exploded. Investigations were launched. Officials were questioned. More victims came forward. For the first time, the system was being forced to answer for its crimes. But the fight wasn't easy. They received threats. She was followed. People tried to shut them down. But they kept going. Because this wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about every child the system had failed. And finally, the people responsible were exposed. The price of a kindness. Months later, as she sat on the same cafe bench where this had all started, she let out a slow breath. He sat beside her, looking at the newspaper in his hands. Corrupt adoption agency shut down. Multiple arrests made. He let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "We did it," she whispered. He looked at her. "No. You did it." She smiled. "No. We did." A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. "Are you ready for what's next?" she asked. He exhaled. "I don't know what's next." She nudged him playfully. "Then let's figure it out together." He chuckled, shaking his head. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. And neither was she. The air felt different now. The calm before the storm had shifted, and what they had fought for, what they had risked everything for, had finally come to fruition. They had exposed the corruption that had separated them, the injustice that had torn families apart. They had given a voice to those who had been silenced for so long. But the battle wasn't over. The fight for justice continued, the scars of the past still fresh in their minds. She sat in the small park near the cafe, watching the leaves rustle in the gentle breeze. The fight was won, but the victory still felt bittersweet. He sat beside her, a small smile tugging at his lips. His face had changed since they first met again. There was something different in his eyes now, something lighter, as if the weight he had carried for so many years had finally been lifted. For the first time, he seemed at peace. The world around them had not forgotten their story. Headlines still circulated, and people still came forward, sharing their own experiences, their own heartache. They had sparked something bigger than they had anticipated. But the truth had come at a price. "We did it," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We made them listen." He nodded, his eyes focused on the horizon. "I never thought it would happen." "Neither did I," she replied. "But I guess we never gave up, did we?" He chuckled softly. "No, we didn't." The road ahead. In the months following their victory, they became symbols of the fight for justice, proof that even the smallest acts of kindness could ignite a firestorm of change. But as much as they had accomplished, both of them knew there was more work to be done. They had brought attention to the problem. But the system was far from fixed. There were still children who fell through the cracks, families torn apart, and those with the power to bury the truth still fighting to keep it hidden. The first step was awareness, and they had succeeded. Now, they had to keep going. The reporters who had covered their story were eager to continue following the case, and the lawyer who had helped them was ready to launch a broader campaign to reform the foster care system. They had a plan, a strategy that would involve reaching out to lawmakers, pressuring those in power, and never letting the story fade into the background. But for her and him, the real work wasn't just about the world, they had their own lives to rebuild. It was hard to imagine how much had changed since that fateful day he had walked into the cafe. The truth had surfaced, and everything had been laid bare. But they weren't the same people who had started this journey. They had found each other again, but they had also found a purpose, one that stretched far beyond the boundaries of their past. "Do you think it'll ever be enough?" she asked, her voice filled with quiet uncertainty. He looked at her, his face serious but soft. "It's never going to be enough. But it's a start." She smiled. "It's a good start." And that was the truth, they couldn't change everything. But they could change some things, and that was all that mattered. The ripple effect. The following years were filled with challenges, but also hope. The work they had started continued, growing beyond their wildest expectations. Slowly, change began to take shape. More people came forward, demanding accountability, and the broken system began to show cracks. But the real victory was in the small victories. The children who were no longer forgotten. The families who fought to stay together. The survivors who found a voice when they had once been silenced. And for every child who was reunited with their siblings, or for every person who had been overlooked, the fight had been worth it. And it didn't just stop with them. They had sparked a movement, a change that reached beyond them. It was no longer just about two siblings who had been ripped apart, it was about the future, about ensuring that this would never happen again. They had made a difference. A new beginning. Years passed, and she found herself standing in front of a small house. The place she had always wanted to own, the place she had dreamed of sharing with her family. She had done it, she had built a life, not just for herself, but for the people she loved. He stood beside her, looking at the house with a sense of pride, a sense of accomplishment. "You ready?" she asked, her voice full of anticipation. He smiled, a real smile this time. "Let's do it." They had come a long way. They had faced the worst of what life could throw at them. But now, there was only the future. They walked into the house together, side by side. They didn't need to say anything. The silence between them was filled with understanding, a shared history that would never be erased. For the first time in years, they were home.